At my daughter's wedding, her groom poured garbage juice over my head while 200 guests watched in silence. And the worst part was that my own daughter never even looked at me. I stood there beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom in Dallas, cold liquid dripping from my silver hair onto the pale blue silk dress I had spent 3 weeks searching for, the same shade my late husband Thomas always said made my eyes look young again. The smell hit me a second later, sour and rotten, like spoiled vegetables left too long in the Texas heat. Someone near the back gasped softly. A woman dropped her champagne flute onto the marble floor. Brandon Hayes still held the empty plastic pitcher in his hand while smiling as though he had just delivered the funniest joke of the evening. "Finally what you deserve," he said loudly enough for the microphone near the sweetheart table to catch every word. A few uncomfortable chuckles scattered through the room before dying quickly. Melissa stood beside him in her custom ivory gown, frozen like a department store mannequin, one hand still wrapped around her bouquet of white roses. She did not rush toward me. She did not defend me. She simply lowered her eyes and stared at the floor while juice slid slowly down my cheeks and onto the pearl necklace Thomas had given me on our 40th anniversary. In that moment, something inside me became very still. Not broken. Not shattered. Just quiet in a way I had never felt before. The wedding planner hurried forward with linen napkins, but I gently raised my hand to stop her. "I'm all right," I said calmly, though my voice sounded distant even to me. Somewhere near the dance floor, a photographer awkwardly lowered his camera. The jazz quartet stopped playing mid-song. Every face in the ballroom carried the same expression people wear at funerals when they do not know what to say to the widow. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew that earlier that morning, before I ever stepped foot inside that ballroom, I had signed papers that changed everything Brandon and Melissa thought they were about to inherit. I slowly reached into my purse and removed a folded cocktail napkin, blotting the corners of my mouth with careful movements while Brandon smirked confidently beside my daughter. He was a handsome man in the polished way expensive men often are. Perfect white teeth, tailored tuxedo, dark blonde hair carefully styled to appear effortless. Most people loved him instantly. Thomas used to say men like Brandon learn very young how to wear charm the same way other people wear cologne. For almost 2 years I had tried to convince myself Brandon truly loved Melissa. I ignored the small comments, the little humiliations disguised as jokes, the way he called me traditional whenever I disagreed with him, the way he rolled his eyes whenever I mentioned family values or loyalty or marriage. But over the last 6 months, I began noticing something colder beneath his polished surface. Melissa changed too. My daughter used to call me every Sunday morning while drinking coffee in her tiny apartment overlooking Turtle Creek. After Brandon entered her life, those calls slowly disappeared. Holidays became shorter. Conversations became strained. Every opinion I expressed suddenly sounded dramatic or old-fashioned. Yet I still paid for nearly everything standing inside that ballroom. The flowers flown in from California, the 6-tier wedding cake, the live band, the honeymoon suite at a resort in Aspen. Even the monogrammed cocktail napkins stacked beside the bar carried the initials M and B in gold foil that I personally approved. I told myself mothers make sacrifices for their children. That was what love looked like. But standing there soaked in garbage juice while strangers stared at me with pity, I realized something painful. Sacrifice only means something when the people receiving it still see your humanity. Brandon casually handed the empty pitcher to a stunned waiter before adjusting his cufflinks. "Relax everybody," he announced with a grin. "It's just a family joke." A few nervous guests forced weak laughter, eager to escape the discomfort crawling through the room. Melissa finally lifted her eyes toward me then, and for one brief second, I thought I saw regret there. Not enough regret to move. Not enough regret to speak. Just enough to remind me that somewhere beneath the layers of manipulation and silence, my daughter understood exactly what they had done to me. I smiled softly at her. Not because I forgave her. Not because I was weak. But because for the first time in a very long time, I no longer needed her approval to survive. 12 hours earlier, I stood alone in my bedroom holding the diamond necklace Thomas bought me in Santa Fe during our last anniversary trip together, wondering whether my daughter would still recognize the woman who raised her once she walked down that aisle. Morning sunlight spilled softly through the linen curtains, painting pale gold lines across the hardwood floor of my home in Highland Park. The house felt too quiet for a wedding day. Years ago, when Melissa was a little girl, she used to run through these halls wearing pillowcases on her head pretending they were bridal veils. She would stand in front of the staircase and announce dramatically that she was marrying a movie star or a prince, or sometimes the boy who sat next to her in second grade. Back then she laughed easily. Back then, she still reached for my hand without hesitation. I sat carefully at my vanity table and fastened my pearl earrings while staring at my reflection in the mirror. At 68, I had finally learned that aging does not happen all at once. It happens quietly. In the way your hands look while buttoning a dress. In the way people interrupt you more often at dinner parties. In the way your own children slowly stop asking for your advice because they assume your time has already passed. I touched the corners of my eyes gently before applying lipstick in the exact shade Thomas loved. Rosewood pink. Subtle and elegant. "You still look beautiful, Evelyn," he used to whisper whenever he caught me doubting myself. Even 3 years after losing him to a heart condition, I still heard his voice clearly in certain moments. Especially on difficult mornings like this one. My phone buzzed against the vanity. Martin Doyle's name flashed across the screen again. Third call before 10 o'clock. I let it ring until silence returned. I already knew what he wanted to discuss because we had spent nearly 4 hours together the previous afternoon reviewing financial documents inside his downtown office overlooking Dealey Plaza. What I learned there had changed the way I saw my daughter's future husband forever. But I was not ready to think about that yet. Not today. Today was supposed to belong to Melissa. I stood and walked slowly toward the garment bag hanging near the closet door. The pale blue gown inside had cost nearly $2,000. Far more than I normally allowed myself to spend, but this wedding mattered to me more than I could explain. I wanted Melissa to look at me proudly when I arrived at the ballroom. I wanted her to remember that before life became complicated, before money and resentment and Brandon entered the picture, we had once loved each other deeply and easily. Downstairs, the kitchen still smelled faintly of the lemon muffins I baked the night before for the bridal suite. Melissa used to request them every birthday morning growing up. I carefully arranged them inside white pastry boxes tied with satin ribbon, because small traditions felt important to me. They reminded me there was still something left worth saving. As I poured coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, my eyes drifted toward the framed family photograph hanging beside the breakfast nook. Thomas stood in the center wearing his old navy blazer with one arm around me, and the other around Melissa after her college graduation. She looked radiant that day. Hopeful. Brandon was not in the picture yet. Sometimes I wondered whether that version of my daughter still existed somewhere beneath the polished makeup and carefully rehearsed smile she wore now. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Martin. "Please call me before the ceremony. It is important." I closed my eyes briefly. Martin had been Thomas's attorney for nearly 20 years. Careful. Methodical. Not the kind of man who used words like important unless he truly meant them. Yesterday he showed me records proving Brandon carried over $400,000 in gambling debt, hidden beneath shell business accounts and unpaid loans. There were also emails, messages discussing my property, my retirement accounts, my late husband's trust. One sentence in particular still echoed through my mind like a church bell. "Once Evelyn signs the transfer papers after the wedding, everything becomes easier." I had not slept much after reading that line. Instead, I sat alone in the dark living room listening to the grandfather clock tick while trying to understand how the little girl who once cried over injured birds and stray cats became a woman capable of standing beside someone who viewed her own mother as a financial obstacle. Yet even after everything Martin showed me, I still chose to attend the wedding. Some part of me remained desperate to believe there had been a misunderstanding. That Melissa would take my hands before the ceremony and explain everything through tears. That she would still choose me over Brandon once the moment finally arrived. Looking back now, I realize hope can sometimes blind a person more completely than cruelty ever could. Around 11 o'clock, my friend Helen Brooks arrived carrying her navy church hat and a bottle of sparkling water. The moment she stepped into my kitchen, her expression softened with concern. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "you look exhausted." I forced a small smile and handed her one of the pastry boxes. Mothers are supposed to be exhausted on wedding days. Helen studied me for a long moment like she wanted to say more. Instead, she simply reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever happens today," she whispered, "remember who you are." At the time I thought she meant nerves. I had no idea she already sensed the storm waiting for us inside that ballroom. The closer we got to the ballroom that afternoon, the more I felt like an unwanted guest at my own daughter's life. Helen drove while I sat quietly in the passenger seat holding the small velvet box containing the family necklace I planned to give Melissa before the ceremony. Traffic crawled along Interstate 30 as dark clouds gathered over downtown Dallas, though the air still carried that heavy Texas warmth that makes even expensive perfume feel too thick against your skin. Helen kept glancing toward me at red lights as though she feared I might suddenly change my mind and ask her to turn around. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to go home, lock the doors, and pretend none of this was happening. But mothers spend decades teaching themselves how to endure discomfort quietly. By the time we arrived at the Grand Magnolia Ballroom, valet attendants in white jackets were already guiding luxury cars beneath the towering entrance arches wrapped in ivory roses and eucalyptus. The entire building shimmered with elegance. Crystal lanterns hung from the oak trees outside, and violin music drifted softly through hidden outdoor speakers near the fountain. It looked like the kind of wedding people saved magazine clippings about. The kind of wedding I had spent nearly 8 months helping Melissa create. Yet the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Nothing obvious enough to point at directly. Just small things. Quiet things. The bridal coordinator standing at the front desk smiled politely before checking her clipboard twice as though surprised to see my name there. A young usher escorted Helen and me toward the seating area without once asking whether I needed to visit the bridal suite first. Last month Melissa specifically told me I would help her put on the necklace and veil before the ceremony. Now no one mentioned it at all. "Maybe she is just overwhelmed," Helen whispered gently as we walked across the marble floor. I nodded even though my chest had already started tightening. Near the entrance to the reception hall, I spotted Melissa's college roommate Jenna arranging gift envelopes into decorative glass boxes. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Carter," she said quickly before lowering her voice. "Melissa is upstairs with Brandon's family right now." Brandon's family. Not with her mother. The words landed softly but painfully. I thanked her anyway and continued walking. The farther inside I moved, the clearer the pattern became. Every framed family photograph displayed along the reception walls featured Brandon at the center beside Melissa. His parents appeared repeatedly. His cousins. His golf partners. His fraternity friends. There were only 2 photographs of me in the entire ballroom. In one, I stood partially cropped at the edge of a Christmas picture from years ago. In the other, I was seated 3 rows behind Melissa at her law school graduation. I stared at that second photograph longer than I should have. It felt less like an oversight and more like someone quietly editing me out of my own history. Evelyn. I turned to find Brandon approaching with 2 groomsmen beside him, laughing about something on one of their phones. He looked immaculate in his tailored black tuxedo, every blonde hair perfectly in place. "Glad you made it," he said casually before kissing the air beside my cheek without touching me. "Melissa is running behind, but honestly that is expected with brides." I smiled politely. "I brought her grandmother's necklace." His eyes flicked briefly toward the velvet box in my hands before returning to my face. "That old thing?" he said lightly with a small laugh. "Melissa decided to keep the jewelry more modern today." One of the groomsmen shifted uncomfortably beside him. Brandon either did not notice or did not care. "Of course," I replied quietly. "Well, enjoy the ceremony," he said while adjusting his cufflinks. "Just try not to get emotional during the speeches. Melissa really wants tonight to stay classy." He walked away before I could answer. Helen stared after him with visible disgust. "That man talks to you like you are an inconvenience." I looked down at the velvet box resting in my hands. Thomas gave that necklace to my mother on her 50th wedding anniversary. Melissa used to beg me to let her wear it while playing dress up as a little girl. I suddenly realized she had not asked about it once during the entire wedding planning process. The ceremony itself unfolded beautifully on the surface. Candlelight glowed against white floral arrangements while the string quartet played softly near the altar. Guests dabbed tears from their eyes as Melissa walked down the aisle beside Brandon beneath cascading orchids. From a distance they looked perfect together. Wealthy. Sophisticated. Untouchable. But perfection often depends entirely on how much truth people are willing to ignore. During cocktail hour, I wandered toward the outdoor terrace searching for a quiet place to breathe. That was when I overheard Brandon's voice drifting from behind one of the stone columns near the bar. "Once the old house sells, Melissa will finally stop stressing about money," he said casually. Another man laughed. "Her mother is really giving all that up?" Brandon snorted softly. "She does not really have a choice anymore." My entire body went still. I could not see them clearly from where I stood, but I recognized Brandon's voice instantly. "Older people cling to sentiment," he continued. "Eventually you just have to make decisions for them." I stepped backward before they noticed me. My heels clicked sharply against the terrace stone, and Brandon's conversation abruptly stopped. I kept walking without turning around. Inside the ballroom, guests continued sipping champagne beneath chandeliers while servers carried silver trays of crab cakes and stuffed mushrooms through the crowd. Everything looked elegant, refined, beautiful. But beneath all that polished luxury, something rotten had already begun spreading through the evening like a stain nobody wanted to acknowledge. I spent most of Melissa's childhood believing love could protect a family from almost anything. Looking back now, I realize love without boundaries simply teaches people how much of you they are allowed to consume. While guests filled the ballroom with laughter and champagne glasses clinked softly beneath the chandeliers, I stood alone near the back hallway outside the powder room trying to steady my breathing. The conversation I overheard on the terrace kept replaying in my head with cruel clarity. "She does not really have a choice anymore." Brandon said those words so casually, as though discussing weather or stock prices instead of my life. I pressed my fingertips against the cool marble wall and closed my eyes for a moment. Memories began surfacing one after another, quiet scenes from years I once considered happy. Melissa at 8 years old sitting beside me at the kitchen table coloring birthday cards for her father. Melissa at 13 crying into my shoulder after girls at school mocked her thrift store shoes because I could not afford designer brands while Thomas recovered from surgery. Melissa at 17 hugging me tightly the night I sold my engagement bracelet to help cover her summer debate program in Washington. "I will repay you someday, Mom," she whispered back then with tears in her eyes. I believed her. God help me, I believed every promise my daughter ever made. After Thomas died, things changed slowly enough that I kept explaining them away. Grief can disguise itself as distance. At first Melissa simply called less often. Then holidays became rushed visits squeezed between Brandon's business dinners and vacations. Soon every conversation revolved around investments, property values, or people I had never met from their social circle in Highland Park. Brandon always spoke confidently about success, but there was something restless underneath him, something sharp and hungry that reminded me of stray dogs Thomas and I once rescued during a storm years ago. Animals that looked calm until food appeared. The first time Brandon openly embarrassed me happened during a charity dinner almost a year earlier. I still remember the smell of grilled salmon and expensive cologne filling the private country club dining room, while guests mingled beneath sparkling chandeliers. I asked Melissa whether she still planned on visiting Charleston with me that summer like we discussed for years. Before she could answer, Brandon laughed and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Evelyn still thinks Melissa has free time for mother-daughter vacations," he joked loudly to the table. Several people chuckled politely. Melissa smiled weakly instead of defending me. I laughed too because that is what women from my generation were trained to do. Swallow humiliation quietly so other people could remain comfortable. After that night, the small insults became more frequent. Brandon called my decorating style museum-like when he visited my home. He rolled his eyes whenever I mentioned family traditions. Once during Thanksgiving dinner, he asked whether I had considered downsizing since older people usually struggle with maintaining large homes. Melissa sat beside him carving turkey while pretending not to hear the implication beneath his words. Even then, I still searched for excuses because mothers are experts at rewriting painful truths into softer versions they can survive. The ballroom doors opened nearby and waves of laughter spilled into the hallway as guests moved toward the reception tables. I straightened my dress and glanced down at the velvet necklace box still resting in my hands. Suddenly it felt absurdly heavy. Melissa no longer wanted the necklace because Melissa no longer wanted anything connected to the woman she used to be before Brandon carefully convinced her that sentimentality was weakness and dependence. "There you are," I turned to find Helen approaching with concern etched across her face. I have been looking everywhere for you. I forced a smile. Just needed a little air. Helen studied me closely before lowering her voice. Evelyn, I overheard Brandon speaking to one of his friends near the bar earlier. My stomach tightened instantly. What did he say? She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable repeating it. He called you an emotional parasite. Said Melissa would finally be free once everything was transferred after the wedding. For a moment neither of us spoke. Somewhere inside the ballroom, the band began playing Frank Sinatra softly while silverware clinked against china plates. Life continued moving around me with polished elegance while something inside my chest slowly cracked apart. Helen reached for my hand. I am sorry. I nodded faintly. No, I whispered after a long silence. Do not apologize for finally helping me see clearly. Across the room, I caught sight of Melissa laughing beside Brandon near the sweetheart table, while photographers gathered around them. She looked radiant in candlelight. Beautiful. Untouchable. Yet there was tension in her smile I had not noticed earlier. A nervousness around her eyes whenever Brandon leaned too close or whispered into her ear. For the first time all evening, I stopped seeing my daughter as cruel and started seeing her as weak. Weak enough to let someone else teach her how to disrespect the woman who once gave up everything for her future. And weakness, I realized then, can destroy families just as completely as greed. The reception officially began just after 7 o'clock, though by then I already felt emotionally exhausted in a way no amount of makeup or polite smiling could hide. Guests filled the ballroom beneath towering arrangements of white orchids, while waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays of champagne and sparkling water. From a distance, everything looked flawless. Expensive. Refined. The kind of wedding people would describe for years as magical. But once you understand how deeply resentment can hide beneath luxury, you start noticing things other people miss. I noticed the way Brandon kept glancing toward me throughout dinner with the same expression people use when monitoring a problem they intend to solve later. I noticed how Melissa laughed too loudly whenever his friends made jokes at my expense, almost as if she feared what would happen if she did not join in. Most of all, I noticed how alone I felt despite sitting in a room full of people I had spent decades loving. My assigned seat was near the back corner beside distant relatives from Brandon's side of the family I had never met before. Earlier versions of Melissa would never have done something like that. When she graduated law school, she saved the front seat beside her for me even though cameras could barely fit us both into the frame. Now I sat 3 tables away from the sweetheart stage while Brandon's business associates occupied the closest seats around the dance floor. Helen quietly squeezed my arm after noticing the seating arrangement. This was intentional, she whispered. I gave a small nod because denying it would have required more energy than I still possessed. Dinner continued with practiced elegance. Filet mignon. Roasted asparagus. Buttered potatoes dusted with herbs. Expensive wine poured into crystal glasses. Around us, guests complimented the floral arrangements and laughed beneath soft candlelight, while the band played old jazz standards near the stage. Every now and then someone approached my table to thank me for hosting such a beautiful event. Melissa is lucky to have a mother like you, one older woman told me kindly. I smiled politely because explaining the truth would have ruined the evening for everyone except the people already ruining it for me. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself and walked toward the quieter hallway near the ballroom kitchen. I needed space to breathe away from Brandon's constant watchfulness. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread from the catering staff preparing dessert trays. As I stood near the service entrance adjusting my bracelet, I heard voices drifting from around the corner. Melissa's voice first. Tight. Nervous. I do not think humiliating her publicly is necessary. Every muscle in my body froze. Brandon answered with a low irritated laugh. You are still thinking emotionally. That is the problem. Silence followed before Melissa spoke again, quieter this time. She already signed the preliminary transfer forms months ago. Brandon exhaled sharply. Not all of them. Martin still has control over the trust revisions, and your mother is starting to ask questions. If she changes her mind now, we lose everything. Lose everything. The words echoed through me with chilling clarity. I pressed myself silently against the hallway wall, while my heartbeat pounded so loudly I feared they might hear it. Brandon continued speaking. his voice colder than I had ever heard before. Your mother spent your entire life treating you like a child. This is the only way she finally understands she is not in control anymore. Melissa did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded small. I just do not want people judging us. Brandon laughed softly again. People forget embarrassment fast once money starts flowing. Their footsteps moved closer. I slipped quietly through the side corridor before they rounded the corner and entered the hallway. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my purse. Everything inside me felt strangely hollow, as though years of confusion had suddenly been replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Clarity. For the first time, I understood that this was never about family disagreements or generational differences or misunderstandings caused by grief after Thomas died. Brandon saw me as an obstacle standing between him and financial security, and Melissa, whether out of fear or weakness or greed, allowed herself to become part of that plan. I returned slowly toward the ballroom entrance where guests had begun gathering for speeches and toasts. As I stepped inside, the warm glow of chandeliers washed over me again while waiters cleared dinner plates and replaced them with delicate slices of wedding cake. The room smelled sweet with vanilla frosting and fresh roses. Beautiful things often exist beside terrible truths without noticing each other. Helen immediately spotted my face and stood from her table. Evelyn, what happened? She asked softly. I looked toward the sweetheart table where Brandon adjusted Melissa's chair for photographers while smiling for the crowd like a man rehearsing kindness, instead of feeling it naturally. Melissa glanced toward me briefly before quickly looking away again. Something inside me settled completely in that moment. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something quieter. More final. I leaned closer to Helen and spoke so softly only she could hear. I think tonight is the last night my daughter still believes I am weak. The humiliation itself happened less than 20 minutes after I overheard Brandon and Melissa in the hallway, though by then I already understood enough to know the evening was no longer about love or marriage. It was about power. About reminding me where they believed I belonged. Guests gathered near the center of the ballroom, while the band shifted into slower music and waiters cleared away dessert plates. The wedding coordinator dimmed the chandeliers slightly until everything glowed gold and soft beneath candlelight. Brandon stood near the stage holding a microphone while Melissa rested beside him with her hand wrapped lightly around his arm. They looked polished, comfortable, like two people fully convinced the future already belonged to them. Before we start dancing, Brandon announced smoothly, I wanted to say something special about family. A few guests smiled warmly. Others raised champagne glasses. Across the room, Helen watched him with narrowed eyes while I remained seated quietly near the back table, my untouched cake still resting beside my water glass. Brandon had the kind of voice people trusted immediately. Calm, confident, practiced. Marriage is not only about gaining a partner, he continued. Sometimes it is also about learning to let go of unhealthy attachments that hold people back. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. Melissa stared down at her bouquet without speaking. Brandon smiled wider. Melissa spent years carrying emotional pressure from people who never respected boundaries. Tonight is about freedom. Fresh starts. Leaving toxic things behind. The room grew noticeably quieter. Somewhere behind me, silverware clinked softly against a plate before stopping altogether. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That surprised me most. I expected anger, shame. Instead I felt strangely detached, almost as though I were watching someone else's tragedy unfold from a distance. Brandon lifted a clear plastic pitcher from beneath the sweetheart table. At first glance it looked like leftover green juice from the catering station near the bar. Then the smell reached me even from across the ballroom. Sour. Rotten. Guests closest to the stage wrinkled their noses immediately. Brandon stepped down from the platform slowly while holding the microphone in one hand and the pitcher in the other. Sometimes, he said lightly, people need help understanding when their season in your life is over. Several nervous laughs scattered weakly around the ballroom. Melissa finally looked toward me then. Her face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Brandon, she whispered softly enough that only people nearby could probably hear it. He ignored her completely. I remained seated while he approached my table because suddenly I understood something important. Brandon expected emotion from me. Tears. Public outrage. A dramatic scene he could later twist into proof that I was unstable or controlling or impossible to deal with. Men like him survive by provoking reactions and then pretending they are victims of those reactions afterward. I folded my linen napkin carefully beside my plate and stood slowly before he reached me. The ballroom had become so silent I could hear the ice shifting inside nearby drink glasses. Brandon stopped directly in front of me, smiling that same polished smile he used in photographs and business meetings. "Finally, what you deserve," he said before tipping the pitcher forward. Cold liquid poured across my hair and shoulders in one sudden wave. The smell of spoiled fruit and old kitchen waste filled the air immediately. Gasps erupted around the room. Someone near the front cursed under their breath. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. Juice dripped slowly down the front of my blue silk dress while candlelight reflected against the sticky stains spreading across the fabric. Brandon lowered the empty pitcher casually like he had just completed a harmless joke at a backyard barbecue, instead of humiliating his new wife's mother in front of 200 guests. Melissa stood frozen beside the stage, gripping her bouquet so tightly several white petals tore loose and fell onto the floor around her heels. I looked at her first, not Brandon. That mattered to me, because Brandon was exactly who he had always been. Manipulative, cruel, hollow underneath expensive suits and practiced charm. But Melissa was still my daughter. The little girl who once climbed into my lap during thunderstorms because she believed mothers could protect people from anything bad. "Mom," she whispered faintly. One word, barely audible. Not an apology, not a defense, just fear. I reached into my purse slowly and removed a folded cocktail napkin. Then I wiped the corners of my mouth with calm, careful movements while the entire ballroom stared at me, waiting for collapse or screaming or tears. None came. "You are right," I said quietly to Brandon. Confusion flickered briefly across his face. "I finally do deserve something better than this." The silence after those words felt heavier than the humiliation itself. Brandon's smile faltered almost imperceptibly for the first time all evening. Across the ballroom, I noticed Martin Doyle standing near the entrance doors holding a leather document case beneath his arm. He had arrived later than expected, but perhaps the timing was perfect after all. Helen hurried toward me carrying clean linen towels from the catering station, but I gently touched her wrist before she could begin wiping the stains from my dress. "Leave it," I whispered softly. "Let everyone see exactly what they are." No one stopped me as I walked slowly across the ballroom with spoiled juice soaking into my dress and dripping from the ends of my silver hair onto the polished marble floor. People moved aside silently to clear a path, the same way crowds instinctively step away from grief because they are afraid some part of it might touch them too. I could feel hundreds of eyes following me while the band remained frozen near the stage with instruments hanging awkwardly in their hands. The smell clinging to my clothes had already begun turning sour beneath the ballroom heat, but strangely, I no longer felt embarrassed. Humiliation only works when the victim still believes they deserve humiliation. Something inside me had shifted too completely for that now. Martin Doyle met me near the entrance hallway without a trace of shock on his face. He glanced once at my stained dress, then toward Brandon standing rigid near the center of the ballroom while guests whispered nervously around him. "I was afraid I arrived too late," Martin said quietly. "No," I answered calmly. "You arrived exactly when you were supposed to." Helen followed behind us carrying a clean shawl from the coat check station. She draped it gently around my shoulders without speaking. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Brandon with a level of disgust she no longer bothered hiding. For a moment, none of us moved. The ballroom behind us sounded different now. Lower. Uneasy. Conversations reduced to murmurs beneath the soft clinking of abandoned glasses and shifting chairs. Brandon had expected laughter and spectacle. Instead, he created silence. The kind people remember for years afterward. Martin adjusted the leather folder beneath his arm before speaking carefully. "The revised trust documents were filed this afternoon at 3:40 p.m. The charitable foundation transfer is already legally protected." Hearing the words spoken aloud steadied me more than I expected. Earlier that day, while Melissa prepared for her wedding surrounded by makeup artists and photographers upstairs, I sat inside Martin's office signing papers that redirected nearly everything Thomas and I spent 40 years building together. The Highland Park home, the investment accounts, the lake property outside Austin. Even the art collection Thomas loved so much. All of it had been transferred into a foundation supporting widowed women facing financial hardship after losing spouses. Women like the version of me who existed after Thomas died. Women who still believed kindness guaranteed safety until life taught them otherwise. Melissa would receive $1 from the estate when the time came. Martin advised against the symbolic amount because he considered it emotionally provocative. I insisted. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. I wanted my daughter to understand that inheritance is not an entitlement. It is trust. And trust, once broken deeply enough, rarely grows back the same way again. Behind us, ballroom doors opened suddenly. Melissa appeared first, still clutching part of her bouquet with trembling fingers. Brandon followed several steps behind her, his expression sharpened with irritation instead of remorse. Even now, he looked more annoyed by the social consequences than ashamed of what he had done. "Mom," Melissa said breathlessly, stopping a few feet away from me. "Please do not leave like this." I studied her face quietly. Mascara shimmered faintly near the corners of her eyes, though she had not cried yet. She looked frightened. Young. Smaller somehow beneath all the designer fabric and professional makeup. Brandon stepped forward before I could answer. "Evelyn, everybody knows this was a joke that went too far. Let us not create unnecessary drama." Martin turned toward him slowly. "Mr. Hayes," he said in the calm voice attorneys use before destroying someone politely, "I strongly recommend you stop speaking." Brandon frowned immediately. "Excuse me." Martin removed several folded papers from his leather folder. "As of this afternoon, Mrs. Carter finalized significant revisions regarding all family trusts, properties, and inheritance structures connected to the Carter estate." Brandon's expression changed almost instantly. Not guilt. Panic. Small but unmistakable. Melissa looked between us in confusion. "What revisions?" she asked softly. I answered her myself. "Everything your father and I built is no longer passing into private inheritance." The hallway became completely silent except for distant music still drifting faintly from the ballroom speakers. Melissa stared at me as though she no longer recognized the woman standing in front of her. Brandon recovered first. Men like him often do. "You cannot make emotional legal decisions after an incident like tonight," he said sharply. "Actually," Martin replied smoothly, "Mrs. Carter signed all finalized documents several hours before the reception began. They are fully enforceable." Brandon's jaw tightened. For the first time all evening he looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. Melissa stepped toward me slowly. "Mom," she whispered. "You are punishing me over one mistake." I looked at her for a very long time before answering because some truths deserve silence before they deserve words. "No, Melissa," I said quietly. "I am protecting what remains of me after years of watching you mistake my love for weakness." Her face crumpled slightly then, not with outrage but with delayed understanding. Somewhere behind us, guests had begun quietly leaving the ballroom while avoiding eye contact with Brandon entirely. Reputation moves quickly through wealthy social circles in Dallas. Faster than gossip. Faster than forgiveness. Brandon glanced toward the ballroom doors as though realizing too late that tonight had not elevated him socially the way he expected. It had exposed him. I adjusted Helen's shawl around my shoulders and turned calmly toward the exit. The sticky stains still clung to my dress. My hair still smelled faintly rotten beneath expensive perfume. But as I walked away from that ballroom beside the people who still respected me, I realized something unexpected. Brandon had poured garbage over my head hoping to make me feel small. Instead, he accidentally washed away every last illusion I still carried about who deserved a place in my life. The next morning, Dallas woke beneath a cold gray rain that blurred the city skyline outside my bedroom windows and left water sliding slowly down the glass like tears nobody wanted to admit to. I sat alone in my kitchen wearing a cream-colored robe while steam curled softly from a fresh cup of coffee beside me. The house felt unusually peaceful after the chaos of the previous evening. No photographers. No guests whispering behind champagne glasses. No Brandon performing charm for strangers while quietly poisoning every room he entered. Just silence. Honest silence. My stained blue dress still hung inside the laundry room sink soaking beneath warm water and detergent. I had considered throwing it away sometime around 3 in the morning after I returned home, But eventually I changed my mind. Some things deserve to remain visible a little longer so you never forget the lesson attached to them. My phone began vibrating against the kitchen counter shortly after 8 o'clock. Melissa's name appeared across the screen for the fourth time since midnight. I stared at it ringing without answering until voicemail finally picked up again. A few seconds later, another call came through immediately after. This time from Brandon. I ignored that one too. By 10 o'clock, there were already messages spreading across social media from wedding guests describing what happened at the reception. Wealthy neighborhoods survive on appearances, and nothing travels faster through affluent Dallas circles than public humiliation attached to money. Several guests privately reached out expressing sympathy. Others apologized for staying silent while Brandon humiliated me. One message from an older woman I barely knew lingered in my thoughts all morning. The way a man treats his wife's mother tells you exactly how he will eventually treat the wife. Around noon, Helen arrived carrying fresh blueberry muffins from the bakery near her church along with several gossip magazines tucked beneath her arm. "You made the society pages online," she said dryly while setting the muffins on my counter. I raised an eyebrow. "How glamorous." Helen snorted softly before pouring herself coffee. "Brandon's business reputation is already taking damage. Apparently one of his investors attended the reception." I remained quiet while stirring cream slowly into my cup. Reputation had mattered enormously to Brandon. Men obsessed with control often build their entire identity around public perception because deep down they know there is very little substance underneath it. "Melissa called me this morning," Helen added carefully. My hand paused against the spoon. "What did she want?" Helen hesitated. "She cried. Said Brandon was furious after learning about the trust changes. Apparently they fought all night after guests started leaving early." I looked toward the rain outside the kitchen windows. 20 years ago, hearing my daughter cry would have shattered me instantly. I would have rushed across the city barefoot if necessary just to comfort her. Motherhood rewires women in dangerous ways. It teaches us to bleed first and ask questions later. But sitting there in the quiet kitchen Thomas designed for me decades earlier, I realized something painful. Melissa had listened while Brandon insulted me for years. She watched him reduce me piece by piece and still married him anyway. Whatever tears she cried now belonged partly to consequences she helped create. Around 2 in the afternoon, Martin Doyle arrived carrying another stack of legal folders beneath his arm. His expression looked grim in the careful professional way attorneys wear concern without fully showing emotion. "There is something you should know," he said after settling into the dining room chair across from me. He slid several printed documents onto the table. "These are financial records connected to Brandon Hayes." I adjusted my reading glasses slowly and began scanning the pages. Credit debts, unpaid business loans, gambling transactions hidden beneath consulting expenses. One line near the bottom made my stomach tighten. Pending foreclosure notices connected to a condominium Brandon secretly owned before marrying Melissa. "He is nearly bankrupt," I whispered. Martin nodded once. "Worse than that. He was depending heavily on your estate projections to stabilize his finances." A long silence settled across the room. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the hallway. I suddenly remembered Brandon's face after Martin announced the trust revisions at the reception. Not anger. Fear. Genuine fear. "Does Melissa know any of this?" I asked quietly. Martin removed his glasses tiredly. "I believe she knows enough to understand she married someone financially desperate." I leaned back slowly in my chair while rain continued tapping gently against the windows. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something dangerously close to pity. Not for Brandon. Men like him eventually collapse beneath the weight of their own greed. But for Melissa. My daughter had mistaken manipulation for strength because somewhere along the way she started believing kindness looked weak. "There is one more thing," Martin said carefully. "This morning Brandon attempted contacting the trust office directly demanding emergency review access. When they denied him, he threatened legal action. Despite everything, I laughed softly at that. Not cruelly. Just tiredly. Brandon still believed money could be intimidated into obedience the same way people could. He still believed confidence alone could rewrite consequences. "What happens now?" Helen asked quietly from beside the counter. Martin closed the folder calmly. Now they learn that humiliation does not always destroy the person standing in the stain. Sometimes it destroys the people who poured it. Later that evening, just before sunset, Melissa finally appeared outside my front door alone. Through the beveled glass panels, I could see mascara streaked faintly beneath her eyes while rainwater darkened the sleeves of her coat. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Then she lifted her hand slowly and knocked once against the door like a frightened child returning home after getting lost. For a long moment, I simply stood inside the foyer staring at my daughter through the rain-streaked glass while memories fought against reality inside my chest. Melissa looked exhausted in a way expensive makeup could no longer hide. Her carefully styled wedding hair now hung loose around her face, damp from the storm outside, and the mascara beneath her eyes made her appear younger somehow. Fragile. Almost like the girl who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares when thunder shook the windows of our old house. But motherhood becomes dangerous when nostalgia blinds you to truth. I unlocked the door slowly and stepped aside without speaking. Melissa entered carefully, clutching her coat around herself while rainwater dripped quietly onto the hardwood floor Thomas installed by hand nearly 30 years earlier. The familiar scent of cinnamon candles and fresh coffee still lingered through the house, warm and steady against the cold storm outside. Melissa looked around the living room as though seeing it differently for the first time. Perhaps she finally understood that homes are not just investments waiting to be sold. They are entire lifetimes stitched carefully together by people who believed family meant permanence. "Brandon left this morning," she said quietly after several seconds of silence. I nodded once and walked toward the kitchen. "Would you like tea?" She looked surprised by the question. "Yes," she whispered. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows and steam curled upward from untouched mugs of chamomile tea. Neither of us spoke immediately. Some silences deserve respect before words interrupt them. Melissa finally lowered her eyes toward the table. "I did not know how bad his debts were." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I remained quiet. She swallowed hard before continuing. "Last night after the reception, he started yelling about the trust money, about the house, about how everything was ruined now." Tears gathered slowly in her eyes. "I kept asking him why the inheritance mattered more than what happened to you. And he just—" She stopped speaking and covered her mouth briefly with trembling fingers. "He said marrying me was supposed to solve his problems." The kitchen grew very still after that. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the hallway. I looked at my daughter sitting across from me in yesterday's ruined wedding makeup, and suddenly I saw the full tragedy of it all. Brandon had not destroyed Melissa. He simply found the broken places already inside her, and taught her to build a life around fear instead of love. "Why did you let him treat me that way for so long?" I asked quietly. Melissa began crying then. Not dramatically, not loudly, just exhausted tears from someone finally too tired to keep lying to herself. "Because I thought if I kept agreeing with him, he would love me enough to stay," she whispered. The honesty of that answer hurt more than anger would have. I leaned back slowly in my chair while studying the woman my daughter had become. So much of her fear suddenly made terrible sense. After Thomas died, I spent years trying to protect Melissa from pain. I paid bills she should have handled herself, solved problems before she faced consequences, covered weaknesses with money and reassurance because grief made me terrified of losing the only family I had left. Somewhere along the way, Melissa learned dependence instead of strength. And Brandon recognized that weakness immediately. "Love built on fear always becomes cruelty eventually," I said softly. Melissa wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "Are you ever going to forgive me?" The question lingered between us while rain continued falling steadily outside. Forgiveness. People speak about it so casually as though it arrives all at once like sunlight after a storm. But real forgiveness moves slowly, quietly. Sometimes it begins simply by telling the truth after years of silence. I looked down at the faint stain still visible beneath my wedding ring where spoiled juice dried against my skin the night before. "I do not know yet," I answered honestly. "But I know forgiveness does not mean pretending something never happened." Melissa nodded weakly as fresh tears slid down her face. We sat there for a long time afterward speaking quietly about practical things. Brandon moved into a hotel downtown after creditors began calling his phone repeatedly that morning. Several business partners already withdrew from pending projects after hearing about the reception incident online. Melissa admitted she ignored warning signs for over a year because admitting the truth felt too humiliating. Near sunset, the storm finally began clearing outside. Pale orange light stretched softly across the kitchen floor while birds returned to the trees near the backyard fence. Melissa stood slowly and carried her untouched tea mug toward the sink before pausing beside me. "Dad would be disappointed in me," she whispered. I looked toward the framed photograph resting near the window where Thomas smiled beside us years earlier at some long-forgotten beach vacation. "Your father believed people could change if they were willing to face themselves honestly," I said quietly. Melissa nodded once before walking toward the front door. Just before leaving, she turned back toward me with tears still shining in her eyes. "I really did love you, Mom." I held her gaze calmly across the fading evening light. "I know," I answered softly. "That was what made all of this so heartbreaking." After she left, I stood alone beside the kitchen window watching the last of the rainwater slide from the oak trees outside. The house felt peaceful again for the first time in years. Not because the pain disappeared. Not because everything was repaired. But because I finally understood something women my age are rarely taught early enough. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And surviving betrayal does not require bitterness. Sometimes it simply requires the courage to stop handing your dignity to people who never learned how to value it.